There are deaths that scream and deaths that whisper. In the shadowed corridors of imperial China's justice system, there existed a punishment so peculiar, so unnervingly civilized that modern historians still struggle to categorize it. Not quite execution, not quite suicide. Something else entirely, something that understood the psychology of shame better than any guillotine ever could. They called it the Silk Coffin. And if you were deemed untouchable by society, if your crime was so profound that your very existence became an insult to the cosmic order, this was how the Empire made you disappear. Not with violence, not with spectacle, but with a gift wrapped in the language of mercy. Let's descend into that darkness together. Imperial China operated on a principle that most Western minds find difficult to grasp. It wasn't just about law and order, it was about cosmic balance. The mandate of heaven, Tiananmen, dictated that the emperor ruled not by force alone, but by divine approval. And when that balance was disrupted, when someone's actions threatened the very fabric of social harmony, punishment had to reflect not just justice, but restoration. The Silk Coffin was reserved for a very specific type of criminal, not the common thief, not the violent murderer. Those deaths were public, brutal, designed to terrify. No, the Silk Coffin was for people whose crimes were considered so philosophically disturbing, so morally unredeemable that their execution needed to be elegant, hidden, almost respectful. Corrupt officials who betrayed the emperor's trust, scholars who committed treason through their writings, noblemen who shattered Confucian principles so completely that their names became poison. These were the recipients of the Silk Coffin, but here's where it gets disturbing. The punishment wasn't imposed, it was offered. Imagine this, you're a high-ranking official. Perhaps you've been embezzling funds meant for famine relief. Perhaps you've conspired against the throne. Perhaps you've committed a crime so intimate, so tied to your honor, that exposure would destroy not just you, but your entire family line for generations. One morning, guards arrive at your residence, but they don't drag you away in chains. They don't beat you through the streets as a warning to others. Instead, they bring you a gift. A coffin made of the finest wood, lacquered to perfection, lined with silk, white silk the color of mourning. And inside that coffin, resting on the soft fabric like an invitation, a length of white silk rope. No words are spoken, none are needed. The message is clear, you have been judged, your guilt is undeniable. But because of your former status, because of who you once were, the Empire is granting you a final dignity. You may choose the manner of your death. You may die in private without public humiliation. You may preserve your family's honor. All you have to do is climb inside. Let's pause here because this is where the psychological horror truly begins. The Silk Coffin wasn't just a method of execution, it was a test, a final examination of your understanding of Confucian values. Because in that moment, when those guards delivered that coffin to your door, you had a choice. You could refuse. You could demand a trial, fight for your innocence, force the Empire to execute you publicly. But if you did that, if you resisted, your entire family would suffer. Your name would be dragged through the streets. Your children would be barred from holding office. Your ancestors' graves might be desecrated. The shame wouldn't end with your death, it would echo through generations. So the coffin became a test of love. How much did you love your family? How deeply did you understand your role in the cosmic order? The Empire wasn't asking you to die, it was asking you to choose death, to participate in your own erasure, to transform your punishment into an act of filial piety. And that is where the true darkness lives. Historical records from the Ming and Qing dynasties are frustratingly sparse when it comes to the Silk Coffin. This wasn't the kind of punishment that was advertised. It happened in the quiet spaces, behind closed doors, in the private courtyards of the disgraced elite, but fragments survive, court documents, memoirs. Letters. One account from the late Ming period describes a provincial governor who was caught accepting bribes during a drought. Thousands had starved while he grew wealthy. When the emperor learned of this betrayal, he didn't order a public beheading. He sent a coffin. The governor received it at dawn. By noon, his body was found inside, the white silk rope around his neck. His family was allowed to mourn. His name was quietly removed from official records. The cosmic balance was restored. Another account from the Qing dynasty tells of a scholar who wrote essays questioning the emperor's legitimacy. Dangerous words, revolutionary ideas, but he was old, respected, his family influential. A public trial would create martyrdom, so the coffin arrived. He took 3 days to decide, 3 days of sitting beside that lacquered box staring at the silk rope inside. On the third night, he wrote a final letter to his son. Then he climbed inside. The letter survived. In it, he wrote, "I am not dying, I am choosing what remains. Let's talk about the silk rope itself, because even in the materials there was meaning. Silk was expensive. Luxurious, it was the fabric of emperors and poets. To die by silk rope was to die as someone who still mattered, even in disgrace. It was the opposite of the hemp rope used for common criminals, rough, cheap, humiliating. The white color carried layers of symbolism. White was the color of death and mourning in Chinese culture. But it was also the color of purity, of clarity, of things reduced to their essence. To die wrapped in white silk was to be purified through death, to have your sins absorbed by the fabric itself. And the act of strangulation, that too was significant. In Chinese medicine and philosophy, the breath, the qi, was the seat of life. To die by strangulation was to have your life force slowly released, not violently severed. It was considered a cleaner death, more aligned with natural order. Everything about the silk coffin was designed to make death feel like a ritual, not a punishment. Like you weren't being killed, you were being transformed. But here's the question that haunts this entire practice. Was it mercy? On the surface, it seems almost compassionate compared to the alternatives. The empire had no shortage of brutal execution methods. Lingchai, death by 1,000 cuts, where the condemned was slowly sliced apart over hours or days. Waist chopping, where the victim was cut in half and left to die slowly. Boiling alive, flaying, the list goes on. Compared to those horrors, climbing into a silk-lined coffin and ending things quickly seems almost gentle. But mercy implies choice, real choice. And the silk coffin was a choice only in the most technical sense. Yes, you could refuse, but the cost of refusal was designed to be unbearable. It was a choice between dying quietly or destroying everyone you loved. Some historians call it coerced suicide. Others call it execution with aesthetics. But perhaps the most accurate term is enforced shame management, because the silk coffin wasn't really about killing the criminal. It was about preserving the social fabric. It was about making sure that even in death, even in punishment, the hierarchies remained intact. The disgraced official could die with dignity because dignity was a tool of control. If you allow someone to preserve their honor in death, their family remains loyal. The system remains stable. It was social engineering disguised as compassion. There's a particular account that I find deeply unsettling, and it comes from the mid-Qing period, around the 1750s. A young magistrate was discovered to have falsified tax records. The amount wasn't enormous. His family wasn't particularly powerful. By all accounts, his crime would normally warrant imprisonment or exile. But the emperor at the time, Qianlong, was obsessed with projecting an image of incorruptible bureaucracy. So the magistrate received the coffin. What makes this account remarkable is that his wife kept a diary. And in it, she describes the 3 days between the coffin's arrival and her husband's death. She writes about how he would sit beside it for hours, not speaking. How he would lift the lid, then close it again. How he tried to write letters to his children but couldn't find the words. How he aged a decade in those 3 days. On the final night, he asked her if she thought he was a coward for choosing this. She told him no. She told him he was protecting them. And then in the early morning hours, while she pretended to sleep, she heard him open the coffin one last time. She never wrote what happened next. The diary simply says, "The morning came late." Her husband's body was found as expected. The family was allowed to bury him quietly. His children were eventually allowed to sit for the imperial examinations. The system absorbed his death and moved on. But in her diary, she wrote one final line about that week. "They gave him a choice that was not a choice, and we thanked them for it." The silk coffin practice began to fade during the late Qing dynasty as Western influence and modernization swept through China. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911 ended imperial rule entirely, and with it, many of the old punishment rituals disappeared. But the psychology behind it that never really left. Even today, in various forms, societies around the world practice versions of the same principle. We call it saving face. We call it plea bargains. We call it resignation under pressure. The language changes, but the mechanism remains, offering someone a dignified exit in exchange for their silent compliance. The silk coffin was just more honest about what it was doing. There's a philosophical question buried in this practice that I can't quite shake. If someone chooses death to protect their family, to preserve honor, to maintain social harmony, is that nobility or is that manipulation? Is it virtue or is it the ultimate expression of a system that has so deeply internalized control that people will kill themselves to maintain it? Confucian philosophy would argue it's the former. That understanding your role in society, that sacrificing yourself for the greater good, that choosing harmony over individual survival, these are the marks of a developed moral character. But there's another reading, one that sees the silk coffin as a nearly perfect form of oppression. Because the most effective control isn't the kind that requires guards and chains, it's the kind that lives inside your own mind. The kind that makes you believe your own death is the right thing to do. The silk coffin didn't just kill the body. It recruited the victim into their own execution. It made them complicit. And that might be the darkest aspect of all. Let me tell you about the last known case. It happened in 1908, just 3 years before the revolution. A military general named Zhao Binglin was accused of selling weapons to rebel forces. The evidence was overwhelming. His betrayal was absolute, but Zhao was a decorated veteran. He had fought in multiple campaigns. His loyalty until this moment had been unquestioned. The Empress Dowager Cixi, in one of her final acts before her death, authorized the silk coffin. Zhao received it with full military honors, guards in dress uniform, a formal ceremony, as if the coffin were a medal for service. According to witnesses, Zhao didn't hesitate. He dismissed the guards, ordered his family to leave, and entered his study with the coffin. 2 hours later, his aide found him inside, the silk rope around his neck, his face oddly peaceful. But here's the detail that makes this story linger. On the wall of his study, he had written a single sentence in ink. "I chose this," 3 words, and historians still argue about what they mean. Was it defiance, acceptance? A final attempt to claim agency in a situation that had stripped him of it. Was he reassuring his family that he wasn't murdered, or was he trying to convince himself? We'll never know. The sentence was painted over after his death. The study was converted to another use. The Qing dynasty collapsed 3 years later, and with it, the entire system that made the silk coffin possible. But that sentence, "I chose this," it haunts me. Because it's the same sentence we tell ourselves every day, isn't it? When we compromise our values for security. When we silence ourselves to keep the peace. When we participate in systems we know are broken because the cost of resistance feels too high. We chose this. The silk coffin exists now only in historical texts, in academic papers. In whispered stories passed down through families who remember ancestors who disappeared quietly with honor intact, but its legacy is everywhere. Every time someone resigns amid scandal. Every time a public figure chooses to spend more time with family after being caught. Every time someone is given the option to leave quietly or face public destruction. The silk coffin is there, updated, modernized, rebranded. We don't use silk rope anymore, we use press releases. Retirement packages, non-disclosure agreements, but the mechanism is identical. Here is your exit. Take it quietly and we'll let you preserve something. Refuse and we'll destroy you. The elegance of the method has survived the empire that created it. So what do we do with this knowledge? What do we do with the understanding that one of history's most psychologically sophisticated punishments was designed not to hurt the body, but to weaponize love, duty, and shame? I don't have an answer. I'm not sure there is one. But I think about those people who sat beside lacquered coffins in the early morning hours, weighing their lives against their children's futures. I think about the calculations they made, the tears they hid, the letters they wrote and then burned. And I think about how many people today are sitting beside their own silk coffins. Not literal ones, but the metaphorical kind, the impossible choices, the decisions that aren't really decisions, the exits that are presented as gifts. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, you can still hear those echoes. The sound of a coffin lid closing, the whisper of silk against silk, the final breath released into white fabric. The silk coffin is gone. But the world it represents, the world where your own sense of honor becomes the weapon used against you, that world never really left. It just learned to hide better. Some deaths scream, some deaths whisper, and some deaths ask you to participate, to choose. To believe that your erasure is an act of love. That's the lesson of the silk coffin. Not that empires are cruel, we already knew that. But that the cruelest systems are the ones that convince you to punish yourself. The ones that hand you the rope and call it mercy. History remembers, even when the names are painted over, even when the coffins are buried, even when we pretend it couldn't happen again, the silk is still white, the rope is still waiting. And somewhere someone is still writing, I chose this.